Welcome to the London Luminaries, 17 heritage properties working together to celebrate our collective history. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm the host for this evening. So I get the delight and the wonderfulness to be able to welcome the most amazing Professor Judith Hawley.
Hello, my name is Judith Hawley and I'm the chair for another in the London Luminaries Lecture Series. The London Luminaries is a voluntary organisation which exists to explore the history of the West of London and is made possible because of the activities of some lovely people behind the scenes. Today is an auspicious day, the 4th of July, possibly a revolutionary day, and our speaker tonight will be describing some of the things that happened during an earlier regime change. Alexis Haslam is our regular speaker from Fulham Palace, a community archaeologist with much experience of digging up good stories. I'm sure he will unearth as many riches as he has on previous occasions. His talk tonight is entitled, "This Cannibal in 3 Years' Space, 300 Martyrs Slew, Torture and Treason at Fulham Palace." Over to you, Alexis.
Hello, good evening. Really looking forward to this one. I am talking tonight about the amazing and rather interesting period of the kind of Reformation, essentially. So, the title of this talk is "This Cannibal in 3 Years' Space, 300 Martyrs Slew," and it is about torture and treason at Fulham Palace. So, this is a very interesting period, as you can see, and I'm sure you're all fairly well aware of sort of what happened in regards of the history of the period. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of run through stuff, give you a bit of background, and then sort of talk essentially about sort of what's happening and what impact this really has on the Bishop of London and how they function within the kind of changing religious landscape, as it were. So to start it off, really, we have the situation whereby Henry VIII dies on the 28th of January, 1547. And obviously during his reign, he has witnessed the initiation of the Reformation. There's numerous events that have essentially driven him to split from Rome. So his marriage to Katherine of Aragon has sadly failed to produce a male heir, but she has given birth to a daughter, Mary. Originally, of course, Catherine was betrothed to Henry's older brother, Arthur, but he died in 1502, and just months after their wedding in 1501. So literally a very, very short marriage. And Arthur got sick and died, and Catherine was also somewhat ill and contracted what was called the sweating sickness that had killed Arthur. So in 1504, Catherine herself is also ill, and she's suffering from shivers and shakes and fever. And so she moves from Greenwich to Fulham Palace, which at the time was between the tenures of Bishop William Warham and then William Barron. So she has this kind of connection to Fulham, which obviously we like to talk about quite a lot. So again, she returns to Fulham Palace in 1506, this time sent by Henry VII, supposedly for her health. But it may, however, also have had something to do with Henry VII being concerned that she's been getting a little bit close to his son, Henry. So as you can see in that image there, that's kind of what we think Fulham Palace looked like at Tudor Courtyard around about that time. So following the death of his father, Henry VIII is proclaimed king on April 22nd, 1509, after the death of his father, obviously. And 6 weeks later, on the 11th of June, he marries Catherine. So this is obviously a bit of a controversial issue in that he's marrying his deceased brother's widow, but he's got a papal dispensation which allows him to do that from Julius II. And so Catherine claims the marriage between her and Arthur was never consummated. There were no children, and therefore it's kind of seen as all right, and they get married. So obviously, he's quite a young king, Henry, and he's leaning on Catherine quite a lot as a confidant and his advisor. He makes Thomas Wolsey his king's almoner, and between 1510 and 1529, kind of Wolsey is really holding the day-to-day reins of government. But things, of course, obviously take a little bit of a turn. In that, Anne Boleyn turns up. So Henry becomes quite interested in Anne in the sort of spring, summer of 1526, and he actively starts to pursue her. And this goes on for quite a while, about 7 years. And this is against all the advice of his advisors. It's against the advice of the Pope and his subjects as well, obviously, the people of England and most of Christendom, in fact, who are not keen on him chasing Anne Boleyn around. But this obviously turns into what we know now as Henry's Great Matter. So Henry wants an annulment of his marriage to Catherine because he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. But there's rumours amongst Anne's faction that Wolsey's deliberately slowing proceedings. So this obviously angers Henry. He strips Wolsey of government office and he strips him of his property in 1529. Wolsey remains as Archbishop of York, but other than that, he's been very heavily kind of stripped of his sort of titles, etc. But interestingly, Wolsey's personal chaplain, was an individual named Edmund Bonner, who we will learn about in a little bit. So Wolsey died at Leicester on the 29th of November 1530. So we really are seeing quite a few changes happening here within sort of Henry's court. And of course, there are indeed issues abroad. So Henry starts to really be sort of the lack of his product of a male heir is making him think that by marrying Catherine, he committed quite a mortal sin through marrying his kind of his brother's his now deceased brother's wife, and this is why she's not produced a male heir. Anne obviously wants him to divorce Catherine, and he wants a legitimate heir as well, a male heir. So things are a little bit complicated though, because Rome's been sacked. Pope Clement VII is pretty much a prisoner under Emperor Charles V, and Emperor Charles V is Catherine's nephew. So you can imagine this is probably a little bit politically complicated for Henry at the time. And again, the general public are keen on that, and they're continuing to support Catherine. So there's a court case to divide the divorce. But this was adjourned by the Cardinal Protector of England, Lorenzo Campeggio, and this makes Henry really, really angry. He feels that he's been humiliated. He's ordered to go to Rome and kneel at the feet of the Pope. So he's really quite livid about all of this. But it does provide him with a perfect opportunity, really, to attack the power and the privilege of the Roman Church in England, which is effectively, obviously, functioning as a state within a state. So the power of the Church is actually not hugely popular. So Henry sees this as an opportunity. So in 1531, the clergy were collectively charged with exercising their power within the church courts to the detriment of royal authority. So Henry's really starting to turn the screws here, as it were. The clergy, they plead guilty to this. They're fined £100,000, but Henry's not done with that. I mean, that's an incredible sum of money. But he summons Archbishop Warham and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he demands that that Henry be recognised as the protector and the only supreme head of the English Church. So you can imagine this is going to cause a few eruptions. But supplication against the ordinaries was drafted by Thomas Cromwell, and we start to see him emerge here. And there are a number of complaints against the church, the ecclesiastical fees and tithes, the use of excommunication as a weapon. And this all, of course, appeals to the layman who's really sort of suffering from these issues. So the clergy reject this, but it's made clear that, that their loyalty was to the Pope, not to the King, obviously, which Henry's not too keen on either. So he makes further demands in regards of royal license superseding church authority. And obviously at Fulham Palace, the Bishop of London is going to have to think about all of this and take it on board. So John Stokesley, who's Bishop of London at the time, actually agrees, although with reservations, to Henry's demands, and he's one of only 3 bishops to do so. So it's kind of interesting to think that Bishop of London actually kind of siding with the King rather than the Pope, which is where we start things really start to take. So Henry really gets his wish in regards of Anne and his divorce. And on the 25th of January 1533, Henry and Anne were married secretly at Whitehall. Archbishop of Warham had died in the summer of 1532, and the Pope, rather bizarrely, replaced him with Thomas Cranmer in February 1533. And this was quite a strange replacement in the sense that Cranmer had always been favourable to Henry, and obviously that plays completely into Henry's hands in regard of this sort of split from Rome. So 25th of May 1533, Cranmer declares that Henry and Catherine never been husband and wife, and he verified the king's marriage to Anne. So essentially, Henry now has his wish. He's divorced from Catherine, and he's now married to Anne. And Cromwell's really undertaking kind of revolution at this point. So what's interesting is that throughout his reign, Henry actually remains a devout Catholic until he dies. And he continually maintains the title of Fidei Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. That was given to him in 1521 by the Pope, and it's on all of his coinages throughout his reign. But despite all this, he's overthrown the faith followed for centuries in England, and it all seems to be to get with the despised Anne Boleyn. So Rome's authority's now been cut off. Payments traditionally made to Rome would now go to the crown, claim the king a heretic or as treasonable, and Mary, the daughter of Catherine, is declared illegitimate. Anne gives birth to Elizabeth, obviously. She's christened, funnily enough, by Bishop Stokely, the Bishop of London, but there is still no male heir. Dissolution of the monasteries, of course, was a huge thing at the time. Religious houses of England was closed down and their lands were sold off. 1536, there's a bill to dissolve the smaller houses. The dissolution of the wealthier houses follows in the next 4 years. And through this, the king gained nearly £1.5 million for the royal coffers, which again is an absolutely huge sum at the time. But parts of the country are really resentful about this, as you're seeing kind of hundreds of years worth of tradition, religious tradition being completely upended and torn apart. And not everybody's happy about this. Henry also authorises an English Bible, and that could be read by the laity, and the Great Bible was printed in 1539. But when Henry died, England was doctrinally still a Catholic country, despite the fact that papal supremacy has been rejected. So it's still very much tied to the Catholic faith. But we're starting to see a real shift here, and the ground being laid for Protestantism to emerge. And this is introduced on his death by Archbishop Cranmer, and the Lord Protector Somerset. So Stokesley's again in a bit of a bind here as Bishop of London. He supported Henry's divorce. He'd even been sent to France and Italy to try and find evidence to support this divorce. He's been president of the nullification of the marriage, and he's assisted in the coronation of Anne as well. So he's very much so in with Henry here. But by 1536, he's starting to have sort of doubts about it all. As sort of Anne's beginning to favour Lutheranism. So you can see this sort of state of flux is really causing a lot of problems. It's a really confusing time. Stokesley's obviously a Catholic, but through his position and through his support for Henry, he's contributed to the establishment of royal supremacy over the church and also the split from Rome. So he's kind of heavily involved with this, and obviously he started to doubt himself somewhat. So things were definitely changing, and Stokesley, as I've said, very much so a Henrician bishop, but he was very anti-Lutheranism, which Archbishop Cranmer began to favour as well. So he falls out of favour with Cromwell. He's not in favour of change within the doctrine of the church, but Stokesley dies on the 8th of September 1539. Again, we really started to see some nasty stuff happening here, and during Stokesley's sort of tenure, we see John Frith, who's a Protestant heretic, burned at the stake and condemned by Stokesley. So we're starting to see here persecution of people based upon their religious beliefs. And the Bishop of London is himself involved in this. So obviously with the death of Henry arrives Edward VI, the son of Jane Seymour. And he's only 9 years old when he inherits the crown. But there's a lot of unresolved issues here. So although papal authority has been repudiated, images and shrines have been removed, churches' holy days reduced under Edward, but neither Catholic doctrine nor ceremony have been renounced. So we're in this kind of strange position where the kind of royalty are pressing for Protestantism, but we're still kind of working within a kind of Catholic framework, which is all rather confusing. And at this point, we see the sort of the significance of Edmund Bonner, who I'd mentioned before as serving for Wolsey. So at the time that Edward comes in, Bonner is the Bishop of London, and he has been since 1540. So he is very much so a dogmatic Catholic. He served for Henry VIII as a diplomat in various places, including in Rome, Denmark, and France. but he is full-blown Catholic, essentially. So this is not going to sit well with him with the arrival of Edward VI. So interestingly, when we look at it, Bonner hadn't actually complained too much about Henry's split from Rome. Despite being this sort of dogmatic Catholic, he feels that orthodox Catholic doctrine can still be maintained without the authority of the Pope. So he's kind of with Henry there. He's got no issue with Henry VIII standing as the church as the head of the Church of England. But under Edward and his protector, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the religious establishment is about to really, really switch, and Bonner's not going to fit into that particularly well. So Henry's bishops have always been pretty much sort of legal, political, diplomatic-based kind of individuals. Edward really wants to make this switch, and the switch to Protestantism is going to need a different kind of bishop. So he wants people in these positions who can preach and teach the new doctrine of Protestantism. He doesn't want the same kind of leaders that his father had had. So he wants individuals who've got backgrounds in things like teaching, such as tutors and schoolmasters or university lecturers. And at the same time, while this is going on, the conservative bishops like Bonner, who are Catholic, they start to realize that their power, and this is all about power at the end of the day, and wealth, is going to be wrested away from them. They are going to lose their positions. So 1549, the Book of Common Prayer is published. And this is an attempt to convert the nation of England to Protestantism. It's largely the work of Archbishop Cranmer. So this is Protestant theology, although again, services are being maintained in the traditional Catholic forms and sacramental language, but it is a huge theological shift here. It doesn't, at the same time, it's not satisfying full-blown Protestants who don't think it's extreme enough, and it's really offending Catholics. So it's really not solving any issues whatsoever. It's just sort of creating more and more problems. And so Bonner's position is that he is not happy. He does not like the new doctrine, and he personally believes that until Edward reaches the age of majority, any action undertaken by him has absolutely no substantive law. He doesn't want to listen to anything that Edward's got to say. So he refuses to have the epistle and the gospel read in English at high mass, and he refuses to enforce the use of the English Book of Common Prayer. When you think that his kind of his flock, as it were, is the city of London and is London, that is quite a significant statement that he's making there. And duly, he is punished. So on the 2nd of August 1549, Edward accuses Bonner of failing to make his constituents attend church, for allowing rites of masses within his diocese, which were banned under the realm. So again, very Catholic kind of based rites, and of failing to adequately maintain London's churches. So he's also saying to him, you're not spending enough money on the churches. So there's a 7-day trial in front of Archbishop Cranmer. Bonner is deprived of the bishopric and he is committed to the Marshalsea prison, which you can see in this image here, on September the 20th. So Bonner has actually been imprisoned for his faith and his beliefs. And we see the switch here. So we now need a new Bishop of London, and it gives, again, Edward and Archbishop Cranmer the opportunity to choose who they want in the position. Bishop of London is a very powerful position. So we get the first Protestant Bishop of London, who is Nicolas Ridley, and he's installed on the 1st of April 1550. And again, he really fits this new mold. He's the former head of Pembroke College. He's been a lecturer at university, so he's very much showing this kind of teaching the new faith kind of mold that Edward really wants. And he immediately begins replacing altars with communion tables. So he's a very significant figure in the history of Fulham Palace, being the first Protestant bishop. But Ridley, we've kind of always got this kind of image of him as being the man who suffers, but he himself wasn't averse to a bit of persecution. And this new Protestant regime was very much so intolerant of radical opponents of the church. And Ridley himself certainly committed nonconformists to execution too. So we are starting to see this kind of bloodlust almost coming in here, based around kind of religious belief. So Ridley himself is directly involved in the cases of the Anabaptist Joan Bottcher and in George Van Paris, who'd adopted the teaching of Arius, which basically meant he denied that Jesus was the Son of God. So we are seeing Ridley start to persecute individuals that he does not believe are following the correct faith, and they are being executed as well. So the image on the left is Edward VI from Fox's Book of Martyrs signing Joan Bottcher's death warrant, essentially. But of course, as we all know, Edward VI died, and this creates huge problems. He probably had TB. He dies on the 6th of July, 1553, and there's immediately this succession crisis. So Edward has opposed the crowning of Mary, the daughter of Katherine of Aragon, because of her Catholic faith, and he's opted for Lady Jane Grey, his first cousin once removed, to follow the faith of Protestantism. So Lady Jane Grey is supported obviously by Archbishop Cranmer and by Bishop Ridley, Protestant Bishop of London, and she's named Queen on the 10th of July. Interestingly, also, Lady Jane Grey was educated by John Aylmer, who would later become a Bishop of London as well. So another link there. But of course, there's this succession crisis in that Mary may be Catholic, but in the southeast and east, despite the kind of growth of Protestantism, she's got a great deal of support. They might have been Protestant areas, but the sort of the general population did believe in the concept of hereditary succession, and Mary is really seen as the rightful heir to the crown, not Lady Jane Grey. There's also a lot of resentment to the Duke of Northumberland. He's seen as corrupt, and the country's been gripped by a period of serious inflation. So there's a lot more support for Mary than there is for Lady Jane Grey within the general population. So obviously, that doesn't work out too well for Lady Jane Grey. Mary assembled a military force at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. Northumberland's support for his daughter-in-law collapses. Jane's deposed on the 19th of July. She and Northumberland are imprisoned in the Tower of London. Jane's executed on the 12th of February 1554. But Mary had ridden into London on the 3rd of August, and she was crowned on the 1st of October. So we now have a new queen. But Mary is, of course, a Catholic. So now we're seeing a switch back to Catholicism where we had Protestantism. So it's incredibly confusing, really. And this does not work out very well for Nicolas Ridley, of course, the Protestant Bishop of London. So Ridley's been imprisoned in the Tower in July. He subsequently moved to Oxford, and he is burnt at the stake on the 16th of October 1655 as one of the Oxford martyrs. So that's the end of Ridley, and he's very much so one of the bishops we talk a lot about at Fulham Palace, because he was executed as a Protestant. And with Mary, of course, we see her trying to kick out Protestantism and bringing back Catholicism. So everyone's kind of hoped that Mary's going to be tolerant as a ruler, and religiously tolerant as well. But it's pretty clear that she intends to overthrow Protestantism completely, reintroduce the Pope's authority, repeal the parliamentary statutes about the church and state, and restore the church Catholic doctrine and services. So who best to fill this position, of course, and Bishop of London, but Bishop Bonner, who's released from prison on the 5th of August 1553, and he gets the bishopric back. So we now have Edmund Bonner back as Bishop of London, and this is, of course, an individual who's been imprisoned for the last few years because of his Catholic faith. So you can imagine he's probably not in the best of moods. And he's supposed to have had a bit of a temper by this point. So he was visiting Haddam, or Much Haddam as it is now, in September 1554. And the story goes that he found that the bells weren't ringing from when he arrived. There was no pastor to greet him. There wasn't enough Catholic imagery on display. So he lost his temper and swung a punch at the pastor, Dr. Brickett, missed him, hit a chap called Thomas Jocelyn instead. And so he's a man who likes to swing his fists when he gets cross, really. So whereas the Dean of St. Paul's at the time tried to blame this on Bonner's time in prison, but Jocelyn apparently replied, now he has come forth from the Marshalsea, he's ready to go to Bedlam. So a lot of people already thought that Bonner was a bit bonkers, to be quite honest. But he really earned this reputation as a rather nasty individual, and is referred to as Bloody Bonner. So Bonner was very much so, as this sort of dogmatic Catholic who's been imprisoned for his faith, he's quite happy to follow Mary's policies of persecution against heresy. Burnings at the stake began at 1555, and 8 individuals were executed between the 20th of January and the 24th of May. So this is all within London. And he had this nickname, Bloody Bonner, and he really, really hated it, which I think made the general population use it even more. So he's supposed to have stated, they report me to seek blood and call me Bloody Bonner, whereas God knoweth I never saw any man's blood in my life. As again, as we can see in Fox's Book of Martyrs here on the right-hand side, he's giving someone a good scourging in the orchard at Fulham Palace for their Protestant beliefs. So Bonner's very much so involved in these Marian persecutions. The argument, of course, is that he's following the orders of the Queen and her council. But when you look at it in the perspective that 1/3 of all persecution victims were burnt within London and therefore within Bonner's diocese, he's pretty knee-deep in this, to be quite honest. 113 men and women were found guilty of heresy within London during Mary's reign, all under, obviously, Bonner's kind of tenure. And he personally pronounced the judgment of execution on at least 89 of them. So, yeah, he may not have liked the nickname Bloody Bonner, but I think he's pretty well earned it, to be quite honest. And this is where the kind of title of the talk comes into it. There was a rhyme sung about him that said, "This cannibal in 3 years' space 300 martyrs slew. They were his food, he loved so blood, he spared none he knew." So yeah, pretty tight remarks about him, really, to be quite honest. But at the same time, things really aren't as straightforward as they seem, in that he might be persecuting people, but this doesn't seem to have a huge effect on forcing everybody to become a Catholic again. So under Edward VI, a large influx of foreign Protestants, refugees, have arrived in London, and they're trying to escape, obviously, persecution for their religion within their own country. So England's quite an open place during the reign of Edward VI. If you're a Protestant, it's a good place to come and kind of get harbour. And it seems that almost the more persecutions that are undertaken under Mary and Bonner, the more the ranks of the Protestant supporters actually swell. So they kind of become quite defiant. But there was kind of like even more stories about what Bonner's been up to in terms of his torture and his treason. So in this image, again from Fox's Book of Martyrs, we have Thomas Tompkins. He was a weaver from Shoreditch, who supposedly had his hand held over a carved candelabra within the Great Hall at Fulham Palace until his veins shrank and the sinews burst. And Tompkins, again, so despite being burnt within the Great Hall, he's burnt at the stake again in Smithfield in March 1555, so he's burnt to death later on. And he must have been a very strong-willed individual to keep going. Thomas Hinshaw and John Wells, as we've seen in the image earlier, were scourged within the orchard. And the palace, Fulham Palace, was indeed being used to temporarily imprison and persecute heretics. I think when we talk about imprisonment, we're not talking about someone being put in a cellar here, but with bars on the windows, etc. But they're basically being confined to the palace until they're tried by Bonner himself. And he was very much so against Lollardy as well. So this is kind of an interesting image in that you can see Lollard's being persecuted here, but actually Bonner's supposed to be in the background beyond that grill. You can kind of see him torturing someone there. So actually, by this point in time, Lollardy is largely underground, but it's still viewed as Protestantism. So Mary's keen to persecute any if she can get hands on them. And the Lollards themselves are opposed to pilgrimage and saint worship. They wanted an English translation of the scriptures. They denied the sort of doctrine of transubstantiation. So these were fair game. If you could get a Lollard, then they were up for a bit of a torture and execution as well, to be quite honest. But of course, it happens again in that Mary dies on the 17th of November 1558, and she doesn't have an heir, which leads to, of course, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, becoming queen. Now, Mary has believed that Elizabeth is going to maintain Catholicism as the national faith. So she's not really worried about Elizabeth eventually becoming queen, but things, again, are somewhat different. So Elizabeth is a little bit more tolerant in terms of the religious stance. And she ends these heretical hunts and burnings, which is definitely a good thing. In 1559, there's the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, which is kind of like a middle ground again. All subjects are required to worship regularly within the regulations of a fairly broad church, to be honest. And the Queen's own ecclesiastical authority is unequivocal, so she's still head of the Church of England. But Bonner, of course, being that staunch Catholic, he refuses to take this oath of allegiance, and he is deprived by Elizabeth of the bishopric on the 30th of May, 1559. And again, he's sent back to the Marshalsea. So Bonner's back in prison again, and he dies there in 1569. So yeah, he didn't have a great end to his life, to be honest. But with Elizabeth, we see the arrival of Bishop Grindal, who's again one of the famous bishops at Fulham Palace, particularly because of his gardening. And he is chosen as a replacement for Bonner. So interestingly, he'd previously served as the chaplain to Bishop Ridley, so he's very much on the Protestant side of things. He'd managed to escape Mary, so he didn't get burnt at the stake or executed, but he ran away to Strasbourg in 1554, which was probably a very sensible move. This was the home of Peter Martyr. He's one of the leading Calvinist theologians of the time and a very close friend of Grindal's. But with the arrival of Elizabeth, the 21st of December 1558, Grindal and another future Bishop of London, Edwin Sandys, whom he was pretty pally with, they begin their journey back from Europe to England. And this brings the return of Protestantism. And from that point on, we've always had Protestant bishops of Fulham Palace, bishops of London. But interestingly, again, as I said, Grindal's very much so known for his kind of botany. And he's supposed to have brought the tamarisk bush to England, where it was grown at Fulham Palace for the first time. And he used this for medicinal purposes to apparently relieve the hardness of the spleen. But throughout all of this, we've basically seen this complete flux, the complete mess that Henry VIII leaves behind, the kind of arrival of Protestantism, the emergence of persecutions of opposing religious factions, all the stuff that Bonner went through, his arrival as a bishop under Henry, his confinement under Edward to prison, his emergence, and his sort of very much so playing a large part in the Marian persecutions. And then with the death of Mary, him being sent back to the Marshalsea again, as we see yet another sort of attempt to implement Protestantism as the main religion in England. And of course, that is very much so the case today. So that has brought me to the end of the talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. But I shall hand you over to Judith so she can tell us about what's coming up.
Thank you, Alexis, very much for that amazing whistle-stop tour of 50 years of chaos and confusion. Now, the Luminaries will take a short break in August, and I hope many of you will have a short break too. And we return on the 5th of September with a talk from Turner's House on conspiracy and betrayal, ancient and modern. And then we have 2 more talks in this season, one in October and one in November. And then we'll start all over again the following year.